Hello everyone and welcome to another video on the ToLiss Airbus A321, and today I'm going to be answering a few questions using my experience as a real-world Airbus pilot to hopefully give you guys a bit more information on your home simulations with the ToLiss on X-Plane. As always, this is just for home use, not for any real-world use at all, but these questions have come up over some of my other videos, so let's get started. The first one, and the question I've had a few times now, is about the use of vertical speed. And how we might use it. So we're in the hold now, and you'll see in some of my videos, especially the full flights, that when holding, I typically use 1,000 feet per minute to descend. So let's say air traffic cleared us down to 6,000 feet now. I'd simply put in 6,000 feet like that, and then I'd start the vertical speed. So I'll set to 1,000, pull that, so vertical speed 1,000, and then I'll set the QNH. And the QNH today is 1011. And there we go. Now that's quite common in the hold. I think I've said before, there could be airplanes above you, there could be airplanes beneath you. You don't want to be going up or down too fast in this sort of area. And that's typically true of flying around in busy airspace. So as we can see here, Heathrow is 15 miles away, we're in the hold. It would be quite common in this sort of area to need to restrict your rate of climb or descent. Now, if air traffic were going to vector me for the ILS, so let's say we're not going to fly this managed nav with these constraints, and air traffic just put us on a vector. So they might say fly heading 270, or let's say heading 260. So we'll go to heading 260 and descend to 4,000 feet. 4,000 feet. So there's no point me just pulling 4,000 feet now and going into open descent, because if I do, we'll see what happens. We'll go from vertical speed to thrust idle open descent. So in vertical speed, it will fly 1,000 feet per minute, and I will level off at a certain point. Now in open descent, it will just go to idle thrust, as you can see here, and it's just going to descend at 220 knots. If I increase that speed, to make that speed at idle thrust, it will have to lower the nose, and it will go down even faster. So this is not a very reliable way to descend and know where you're going to level off. This is more useful for getting height off if you're a bit high, or if you're doing large changes. The other advantage of descending in open descent is that it has the ability to protect you for speed. So I will keep 220 knots, and speed is obviously incredibly important to us as pilots. If I descend in vertical speed, and I make this vertical speed 4,000 feet per minute, we won't actually fly 220 knots. So if air traffic control have asked me, I need you to do 220 knots, and I fly vertical speed, but I set the wrong vertical speed, you'll see that we can't actually manage it. So getting the balance between vertical speed and open descent is a bit tricky. Typically, if you're low on profile, you can use vertical speed like this in the descent, because it means that, say I set 500 feet per minute. Now I'm going to come back onto profile, and then the engines in speed mode will keep 220 knots. So that way I'm keeping my speed and I'm getting back on profile. If I was a bit high, I would probably go to open descent and use the speed brakes, because that way the airplane will lower the nose and increase the speed. I'm going to do some more videos on descent and energy management. It's quite a big topic, and it's something that takes pilots a fair bit of time and experience to get used to, especially when you start flying these larger airliners, jet airliners as well, because they're quite slippery through the air. So that's a very long answer to a short question, really, which is vertical speed of 1,000 feet per minute. I definitely use that in the hold. In the descents in the terminal area, something like that, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 feet per minute, if you're a bit high, would be typical. I might use open descent while configuring. Let's say we were cleared down to 3,000 feet, and I want to also, and I'm told to slow down. So I can go to manage speed, because I've got the approach phase activated. We're set up for the approach into Heathrow here. And then if I go to open descent, thrust idle open descent, and the airplane lowers the nose because it's trying to fly at green dot. But now, if I put out flap 1, like that, and we get 1, you'll see that the new speed target is the S speed. So the airplane now does a sort of balance between descending and slowing down. So it's still at idle thrust, and it's slowing down. If I then put out flap 2, it continues to keep a shallower rate of descent as it lets the speed come back. So you could use open descent whilst slowing down to have a controlled rate of descent. But as I said, if I was to then increase my speed in open descent, I would just descend very quickly down. So now let's look at climbing. So we're here climbing, let's wind that right up. So we're climbing to flight level 280 for some reason. So what mode did I use here? Would I use vertical speed of 1,000 or what? Well, I'm going to use open climb because I want to climb up quickly. If that level off was lower, let's say it was nearer, then I would want to control my rate of climb. So 3,000 feet per minute is too fast, so I would increase the speed, or I would use vertical speed. Now, there is a problem with using vertical speed in the climb, which I'll show you now. If I select vertical speed, it's very similar to what we saw earlier. If I choose a speed that is too high for the airplane to manage, we actually lose energy and we get slow, which is very dangerous. So vertical speed you have to be very careful using in the climb. If you're very high, I would recommend using open climb, because if you use vertical speed you might find that the airplane can't manage it. Now it could be that air traffic asks you to maintain a vertical speed, and it's hard to judge if you can. But if you're climbing from, let's say, I don't know, if you're very heavy and you're climbing above flight level 300, you could find that it's hard to maintain even 1,000 feet per minute. It's quite normal. I know there is a bug on the ToLiss Airbus at the moment as well, where some of the higher speed drag is a little bit too high, so they're working on fixing that. But there we go. Just some ideas about how it might use vertical speed. Okay, so here we are back in the hold at Bovingdon, all set up for our ILS at Heathrow, exactly as we were earlier. Another question I've had is talking about TCAS. So let's move over to the TCAS panel. And the question was, setting above, normal and below, does this change what we can see on the TCAS? Absolutely, it does. So in the climb, I would typically set it to above, because then it's going to show us traffic from 2,700 feet below us to 7,000 feet above us. So it still shows you some traffic beneath you, even when it's set to above, but it shows you a higher range above you, 7,000 feet above you. If it's set to normal, all it does is show you 2,700 feet beneath and above you. And if it's set to below, like it would be in the descent here, it's going to show me traffic up to 2,700 feet above me. So that would be 10,700 feet, or 7,000 feet beneath me, so all the way down to 1,000 feet above the ground. So it's useful for getting a picture. It would display that on our navigation display, so you'd see little diamonds on here, as you've probably seen in other simulators. Now what's important to remember is it doesn't actually matter what I set that to, it only changes what I can see. The TCAS will still respond to aeroplanes above and beneath you, so it's not a risk that you won't get a TCAS, it just means you won't be able to see it displayed properly on the screen until you're within a closer range. But even set to below, I can still see a couple of thousand feet above me, and likewise set to above, I can still see a couple of thousand feet below me. TCAS prioritizes what it shows as well. If you have too many aircraft in the vicinity, it will only show you the ones it sees as the nearest issues. So it's not reliable to use this screen to navigate around other airplanes at all. That's not the intent of TCAS. TCAS is entirely its own system, and we just obey it if it talks to us. So that display it's not, I don't want to say trivial, but it's not as important as it might seem at first. Okay, so let's move on to our approach to Heathrow, and we'll talk about the localizer. So another question I've had is, what does the localizer button do? And if we look on our FCU, we can see it here, localizer. So in a previous video, I used the expedite button, and someone quite fairly said, well, what does the localizer button do? Well, we've got our localizer displayed here and our glide slope here. And typically, we will arm the approach by pressing APPR, and it will arm both of those modes, so that when you then reach the localizer or the glide slope, the aeroplane will intercept them. What will happen if you do the localizer button is it will only arm the localizer, and it will only intercept the localizer, and it will not capture the glide slope. So it will just stay at whichever altitude or vertical mode you were using before. So I'll show you that now. So now we're heading in towards Heathrow, and this is where I could show you a quick example of the vertical speed. Let's say air traffic control gave us heading 180 to head south, and we're heading towards our localizer here. I know I'm low, or certainly I don't need to be any lower on the profile, because the runway is still 18 miles away from me, even from here, and I'm at 5,000 feet. So I wouldn't go into open descent, because if I do, the airplane will just go to thrust idle, and it will descend right away down to 4,000 feet, and then I'll be flying level, which will take more thrust and burn more fuel. So it's more efficient to try and fly continuous descents, which is what we try and do. It's less fuel, it's quieter, and it means that the people living down below don't get to hear the engine spooled up as much, that sort of thing. So it's quite common procedure these days to try and keep it roughly continuous. It doesn't matter if you level off, it's not the end of the world, but it's something we try and do. Certainly you don't want to mess up the safety to try and keep a continuous descent, but it is something that we aim for. Okay, let's just check we don't need the anti-ice. 10 degrees. So if it's bang on, usually when you enter clouds, the temperature drops a few degrees, so we'll put that on. I doubt that's simulated here. I'll be quite impressed, but there we go. So just in case. So now we're going to level off. I've got the approach phase active, so let's go to manage speed, and I'll show you what happens. By the way, if you're vectoring yourself, I will do another video on this because someone's asked and it's quite a good idea. But typically, an intercept from 90 degrees, we've got a bit of a tailwind, so maybe about 2 miles I'll turn onto an intercept heading. Your intercept heading should be 30 degrees as a maximum off. There's our round star. And we're at 4,000 feet, so 4,000 feet would be about 12 miles on the glide slope for a 3-degree glide slope. You can calculate that because it's 3 times, so 4 times 3 is 12, so that would be a 12-mile final from 4,000 feet. Okay, we're definitely time to turn, so it's 090, so we'll go to maximum of 120, and I'm just going to arm the localizer. So I press that, we get lock blue, and that's all that's armed. Lock star, that was quite a late one, so we'll actually probably go through. Let's go flap 1. And there you go. So we're a long way out, 16 miles out, and it would be unlikely for air traffic control to clear you to descend with the glide slope this early. And that's the main reason we might use the localizer. Thrust out open descent, and let's change that to vertical speeds. Let's do 1,200 feet per minute. And flaps 2. Okay, so air traffic control would, from this distance, would probably clear you for the localizer, but we're not down on our platform altitude yet of 3,000 feet. So they could clear us to descend with the glide slope, in which case I would now just press approach and it would arm the glide slope. Or they might wait. There could be aeroplanes beneath you. There could be other airspace beneath you, so they can't clear you to descend until closer in. So it's not uncommon for air traffic control to say, and turn this left onto this heading and intercept the localizer. And then once you're there, they could then say descend 3,000 feet. And now they might say, okay, descend further with the glide slope. And now we could arm the approach. So if they said just right now, descend with the glide slope, I'll just press approach. And there you go. Now glide slope is arms there, and we can engage the second order pilot. And that's a typical use of the localizer button. Quite common, in fact. One other way we might use it is if we were flying a localizer-only non-precision approach. So a localizer-only approach would mean we can track the localizer, so I can want it in lock mode, but we'll fly vertically using vertical speed and checking our profile, just as we did in our VOR tutorial. So that's a different sort of approach to an ILS, a localizer-only approach. So in that case, yes, you would just arm localizer. Another question I've had is about using auto flap protraction, which came up from the maximum performance takeoffs I did in my last video, where we looked at being heavyweight, short runways, and so on. So let's have another look at it here. So we're back to taking off in Bristol at a heavy weight. We've got 20 tons of fuel on and so on. And what I want to make clear is that flap protraction happens automatically only for config 1, but it is automatic. There's not much you need to do. There's not anything you need to do except monitor it. So let's get the autopilot in so we can talk about it. Positive climb, gear up. Okay, so I think it was unclear because I did some of the flap protraction using this and some using my joystick. So let's put it like this so we can see, and I'll show you down here what I'm actually doing. Oh, we don't need that one, we need that one. Okay. And to make it simple, I'm going to make it go to 250 knots when we get there. So we've taken off flap 3 in Mantoga because that was the performance required. And now it says lever climb. So I go 2 clicks back with the thrust levers to our climb gate. There we go. And now the airplane will accelerate. When I get above my F speed, doesn't matter if I took off flap 2 or flap 3. Once I'm above the F speed, I'm going to go to flap 1. So I have to do this manually. So I'm in flap 3 and I manually go from flap 2 to flap 1. And there we go. And now we go to 1 plus F. The airplane automatically does that. And you see it retrimming and so on as the Airbus does. Now I'm actually going to increase the target speed. I'm going to pretend that we don't have a speed limit. So we're going to go straight to 250. And here we go, accelerating 1 plus F. Now, the auto retraction happens at 210 knots as the speed increases. The flaps will automatically retract. There's no mode I need to do. It just happens automatically on takeoff. The Airbus accounts for it. It's pretty good at things like that. So I'm not going to move anything. I'm not touching any buttons or any levers. And you'll see we'll hit 210 knots. they will retract, and then we'll be flying around with just effectively 1, which is just the slats, not 1 plus F. 210, they retract, and now we're just 1. You see the 1 plus F is gone, but the lever just stays where it is, stays at the 1. And now, when I'm above the S speed, I have to retract the rest of it myself. So from 1 to 0, and now the slats retract. So hopefully that makes sense. It's ready, it's automatic, but you've got to do your normal configuration changes, just aware that passing 210, the flaps will come in, and that will allow you to get to your S speed if you're very heavy. Great. A couple of questions I've had about the high performance takeoffs as well include, would we ever use toga thrust or high performance takeoffs for a normal length runway in a light aeroplane due to runway conditions, that sort of thing? Which is a great question, and it's absolutely correct. If we're looking at this picture out here where it's -7 degrees outside, we'd have the engine NTIs on, and we were going to take off. Even though this is Munich Echo Delta Delta Mike is a very long runway, and we're in a lightweight 321, 73 tons, not particularly heavy, then it could be that we are required to use toga thrust because of the conditions. Now this depends on airline SOP and so on, so I can't give exact numbers and so on. But if a runway is contaminated, so it's got a lot of slippery contaminants like, for example, snow or wet snow, or frozen deposits or dry snow, all of these sorts of things, then there's quite a complex process to go through to determine what performance figures you need to use. But there is a high chance you'll need to use toga thrust to give the airplane maximum performance, and that's just a sort of an SOP thing. Another question about it was, what about turning off the packs? Great question. So as you can see on our air conditioning panel, pack 1 and pack 2 are here, and we use both of these packs to provide air conditioning to the cabin. And we do that on the ground while we're taxiing. We do it all throughout the flights. It is possible to dispatch with one of these in op, and you can fly with one. That's totally fine. So what about using it to turn it off to get more power out of the engines? Well, in the real airplane, if you turn off these packs, both of them, the N1 that you're idling at will actually reduce. So if you do this in your ToLiss Airbus, you'll hear it go a little bit quieter because the air conditioning air gets turned off. So now there's not really any air coming into the cabin. It's just recirculating with the fans, so it wouldn't be enough to pressurize you. But for takeoff, it's quite common to turn these off like this and then take off, and then we carry on with a normal takeoff. And once we get to acceleration altitude and we bring the thrust levers back to climb thrust, once we've done that, we can turn them back on again once we're at climb thrust. The reason is it takes less fuel because these take quite a lot of power from the engine, more than you might imagine. It's not appearing to be simulated for me in the ToLiss, because I would expect in the real airplane, if I turned one of these on or both of these on, this N1 would increase slightly. The reason is the engine at idle would need to be running at a slightly higher power in order to give us the air that we need, so that you'll see this number increase. Same for the engine anti-ice. This actually would increase the N1 by having it on. So if you're taxiing around on a snowy, wet day with both the anti-ice and the packs on, it's actually, you have quite a high N1. It could be 24, 25%, which could be giving you thrust that you're trying to slow down from when you don't actually need it. So yes, we do. If you're in a short runway somewhere as well, you would consider turning off the packs for takeoff, because it will allow you better performance. You'll have more thrust available at toga thrust because it's not being diverted into feeding the air. The reason it's being diverted, the way we get the air, is because it comes out of the engine's compressor stages. So you're taking away some of that compressed air from the middle of the engine and putting it into the cabin through quite a complicated process, but that effectively takes away some power from the engine. So that's it for today's Q&A. I hope that's been useful and cleared up some of the things that have come up in previous videos. I'll keep doing these Q&As as time goes on, so please keep the questions coming, keep the interaction, and that way we can hopefully get some help for our home simulations between us all as a community. Not all these answers are going to be perfect. There'll be differences between airplanes and so on, and some things may be my opinion, so obviously none of this is for any real-world use as usual. And hopefully we'll see you again in a video soon where we can talk about more things Airbus X-Plane related. Thank you very much for watching.